China's latest AI breakthrough has leapfrogged the world.
I think we should take the development out of China very, very seriously.
A game-changing move that does not come from OpenAI, Google, or Meta.
There is a new model that has all of the valley buzzing.
But from a Chinese lab called DeepSeek.
It's opened a lot of eyes of like what is actually happening in AI in China.
What took Google and OpenAI years and hundreds of millions of dollars to build, DeepSeek says took it just 2 months and less than $6 million.
They have the best open source model, and all the American developers are building on that.
I'm Deirdre Bosa with the Tech Check Take, China's AI breakthrough.
So I'm excited about this topic. DeepSeek has definitely been talked about in the industry at this point in time. I know I'm currently doing some initial research on it myself, trying to poke around, see what it's like. I don't have too many details myself yet on my opinions of it, but it does seem to be pretty good overall for the purposes. They've mentioned how it's generally cheaper to build. I would say always look at those statements with skepticism, especially since it's self-reported. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was cheaper for them to build. Obviously, they've already seen and heard how the US companies built their models. And so obviously, this is one of the advantages to coming in later in the market, is you don't necessarily need to make the same mistakes as the initial people who are trying to build this up from the bottom floor. And so they might have been able to just jump ahead in certain aspects, understanding how that model was developed to save costs. Also, it's unclear how well people are paid who are working on this product versus some of the ones in America, for instance. I know some of the big AI companies, they get huge salaries compared to most other tech companies right now. So they're paying a premium for those engineers. So if you hired standard engineers at a standard price, you already would get a discount. Trying to get ahead of what other folks are doing and understanding how they got there, you could save some more money. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did make it cheaper in their training segment, but always take those things with a grain of salt. Beyond that, it does seem pretty good. One of the coolest features that I've seen from it is that you can have it describe its rationale, which is very cool because a lot of the other big language models that kind of work on a variety of topics like ChatGPT, etc. Usually they just give you an answer. Potentially some of the more premium options potentially give you that. So take that with a grain of salt myself. I don't know everything about these models, but I think that's one of the key advantages. DeepSeek is also cheaper for SaaS purposes. So if you want to use a model like this, it's going to be noticeably cheaper than some of the other bigger companies that are already known in the US. So that certainly adds a draw in and of itself. And you're able to use it in a variety of purposes. So you can actually self-host this much easier than some of those other models because they have it open sourced, which make it very easy for adoption. So this is definitely a model that I would be expecting a lot of people to be using. If you can use it cheaper, there's no reason why people wouldn't start to gravitate towards it. So I'm curious to see what they're going to say about it, but this is very exciting in the AI space. It's definitely something that is getting a lot of attention right now.
It was a technological leap that shocked Silicon Valley. A newly unveiled, free, open source AI model that beat some of the most powerful ones on the market. But it wasn't a new launch from OpenAI or model announcement from Anthropic. This one was built in the East by a Chinese research lab called DeepSeek. And the details behind its development stunned top AI researchers here in the US. First, the cost. The AI lab reportedly spent just $5.6 million to build DeepSeek version 3. Compare that to OpenAI, which is spending $5 billion a year. And Google, which expects capital expenditures in 2024 to soar to over $50 billion. And then there's Microsoft that shelled out more than $13 billion just to invest in OpenAI. But even more stunning, how DeepSeek's scrappier model was able to outperform the lavishly funded American ones.
To see the DeepSeek new model, it's super impressive in terms of both how they have really effectively done an open source model that does what is this inference time compute, and it's super compute efficient.
Yeah, agreed. This is definitely impressive.
It beat Meta's Llama.
So it looks like they're going to use some data here to reference this. It's using accuracy for some method here. It's unclear how they broke this up for a variety of purposes, but they basically have some percentiles of accuracy that they are defining for some purpose. That's the y-axis. The x-axis has basically a variety of categories that are being used. So they have like math 500, I don't know what that means, AIME 2024, code forces. So it seems to like have a lot of benchmarks that it's trying to use for assessing this model. I haven't actually tried using this for a variety of purposes myself yet, but again, one of the advantages of being an incumbent in the space, especially for some of those other models, is that you get direct access to them and you can ask them questions. So it's unclear whether these are cherry-picked benchmarks or if this is a more standard version of it, but you can see the results from the other models, and so you could have just waited until your model was slightly better. And all of these models themselves, like ChatGPT or Claude is a famous one from Anthropic, and so those as examples, they do have versions to them, and you can see their performance improve over time. And you could even see sometimes where somebody will delay their release and then they'll follow a big release by a preceding company, and they'll make sure that their performance and accuracy are a little bit better, so that way it draws attention. And so we've started to see this trend in AIs and these models that are being developed, where basically they'll kind of chain releases company to company, and then they'll try to one-up the previous release from their competitors to grab more attention and get more share. And so this is definitely what I would expect, not necessarily just from DeepSeek, but any other AI competition that exists, is that they would be looking to outperform their competition in order to stand out. And this has been going on for a variety of months, maybe the last year or so. And so this is definitely exciting. And they've mentioned the fact that some of these other companies have used billions of dollars. It's arguable. I've never worked at one of those companies, but it's possible that there was a lot of waste involved with that. Again, being in California, you just have a lot of overhead. Things are more expensive there. Engineers are more expensive there. And so those things can certainly balloon up in cost. And again, this is where being the first one, you're going to have to run into every hurdle for the first time, whereas you can potentially skip over these things. So none of these things are particularly surprising, but it is still impressive. I think somebody was bound to do something like this, but it's really cool to see it happening right now.
OpenAI's GPT-4o and Anthropic's Claude Sonnet 3.5 on accuracy on wide-ranging tests, a subset of 500 math problems, an AI math evaluation, coding competitions, and a test of spotting and fixing bugs in code. Quickly following that up with a new reasoning model called R1, which just as easily outperformed OpenAI's cutting-edge O1 in some of those third-party tests.
Today, we released Humanity's Last Exam, which is a new evaluation or benchmark of AI models that we produced by getting, math, physics, biology, chemistry professors to provide the hardest questions they could possibly imagine. DeepSeek, which is the leading Chinese AI lab, their model is actually the top performing, or roughly on par with the best American models.
They accomplished all that despite the strict semiconductor restrictions that the US government has imposed on China, which has essentially shackled them out of computing power. Washington has drawn a hard line against China in the AI race, cutting the country off from receiving America's most powerful chips like NVIDIA's H100 GPUs. Those were once thought to be essential to building a competitive AI model, with startups and big tech firms alike scrambling to get their hands on any available. But DeepSeek turned that on its head, sidestepping the rules by using NVIDIA's less performant H800s to build the latest model and showing that the chip export controls were not the chokehold DC intended.
They were able to take whatever hardware they were trained on, but use it way more efficiently.
But just who's behind DeepSeek anyway? Despite its breakthrough, very, very little is known about its lab and its founder, Liang Wenfeng. According to Chinese media reports, DeepSeek was born out of a Chinese hedge fund called High Flyer Quant that manages about $8 billion in assets. The mission on its developer site, it reads simply, Unravel the mystery of AGI with curiosity. Answer the essential question with long-termism. The leading American AI startups, meanwhile, OpenAI and Anthropic, they have...
Just for reference, since they didn't explain it here, AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. It's basically the term used for what I would assume the standard non-technical individual would expect AI to be. It's just a really smart machine that can handle a variety of tasks, whereas AI, especially nowadays, is being overloaded for a variety of purposes, where even simple algorithms can be coined as AI just to follow the trend. And so basically AGI was a new term that is being used to sort of distinguish these higher performing and smarter models and actual machine learning trained systems compared to more historical, less smart, less intelligent versions of AI.
Detailed charters and constitutions that lay out their principles and their founding missions, lengthy sections on AI safety and responsibility. Despite several attempts to reach someone at DeepSeek, we never got a response.
How did they actually assemble this talent? How did they assemble all the hardware? How did they assemble the data to do all this? We don't know. And it's never been publicized, and hopefully we can learn that.
But the mystery brings into sharp relief just how urgent and complex the AI face-off is.
So they've mentioned already kind of using these less powerful machines. And so that is a classic thing done in technology, broadly speaking. So being somebody in the industry myself, this is a common trade-off that you make, which is usually you can try to aim for the highest performing, fanciest hardware that can exist. And usually you do that for actual performance reasons. So usually it's when you want to perform tasks very, very, very quickly. And usually you pay a premium for that. In many cases, most tasks don't require the highest end machine that is possible and available to you. And so this is something where if you're smart about the usage, it's generally been known to my expectation in the industry that if you go with kind of lower tier or mid-tier hardware, that's usually more abundant, more readily available, and you optimize your system for those, they can be cheaper and more cost effective than the higher end models and higher end hardware that exists. And so that's not surprising to me. They probably could have used any hardware really for this purpose. A lot of folks are focusing in on GPUs for the particular optimizations that they have. Generally speaking, they are really good at like matrix math versus more standard arithmetic, let's say, for CPUs. But you could even train a model on CPUs. I'm sure there's some AI or ML evangelist out there who is horrified by me saying that, but it's still true. It would go much slower, and it can be less cost effective depending on how you set things up. But there's a variety of ways that you can do this, and this is something that is standard practice in the technology space, is to optimize not just for the most advanced hardware, but looking at where you can find the best bang for your buck. And so they probably could have done this with any hardware that was available to them. There's nothing necessitating those top-of-the-line chips, but it could potentially reduce time, but also you can offset this with numbers. So this is a classic example that is done, which is in some cases, maybe the newest, fanciest hardware can be 3 times the cost of like a few years old model. But then those older models are now cheaper and they're maybe discounted. And so you could potentially just outscale it by just having more and more of those older, cheaper machines. And so this is a classic way to offset that delta in performance for these types of machines for cost efficiency. So that's not surprising at all. Also, I wouldn't be surprised. AI and model development, there's so many people who are into this space. And obviously China is a huge country. So they would have a plethora of engineers to interact with. And I'm sure if this was somebody's primary focus and they were backed and supported by the government, this is definitely an achievable act. These individuals seem to be acting particularly surprised that like this was an impossible feat. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's impressive how they've done it, but I think it could have been done and it was achievable if this was your primary focus. And this is where these individuals did put their thought and effort into it.
Against China has become, because it's not just DeepSeek. Other, more well-known Chinese AI models have carved out positions in the race with limited resources as well. Kai-Fu Lee, he's one of the leading AI researchers in China, formerly leading Google's operations there. Now his startup, 01.ai, it's attracting attention, becoming a unicorn just 8 months after founding and bringing in almost $14 million in revenue in 2024.
The thing that shocks my friends in the Silicon Valley is not just our performance, but that we trained the model with only $3 million. And GPT-4 was trained by 80 to 100 million.
Trained with just $3 million. Alibaba's QN, meanwhile, cut costs by as much as 85% on its large language models in a bid to attract more developers and signaling that the race is on. China's breakthrough undermines the lead that our AI labs were once thought to have. In early 2024, former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, he predicted China was 2 to 3 years behind the US in AI. But now, Schmidt is singing a different tune. Here he is on ABC's This Week.
Well, I used to think we were a couple of years ahead of China, but China has caught up in the last 6 months in a way that is remarkable. The fact of the matter is that a couple of the Chinese programs, one, for example, is called DeepSeek, looks like they've caught up.
It raises major questions about just how wide OpenAI's moat really is. Back when OpenAI released ChatGPT to the world in November of 2022, it was unprecedented and uncontested. Now the company faces not only the international competition from Chinese models, but fierce domestic competition from Google's Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, and Meta's open source Llama model. And now the game has changed. The widespread availability of powerful open source models allows developers to skip the demanding, capital-intensive steps of building and training models themselves. Now they can build on top of existing models, making it significant.
Yeah, this is a great point they're bringing up right now, which is something that I referenced earlier on, which is why this is getting a lot of attention, which is in the classic models, they make them private. And so what this means is that you have to go through them and through their paid model in order to gain access to these resources and the answers that you get for like a ChatGPT. And so they can price it at whatever they want because they effectively have a monopoly on ChatGPT. And so other competitors in the space have followed a similar model. And so they're fairly expensive to use at scale. And one of the key distinctions is that for something like Llama or for DeepSeek, you can spin these up yourself. Like you can just start running it on your laptop. It doesn't even need to be connected to the internet after you set it up, and you can just start asking it questions. And so you can use it for whatever purposes you want. You could basically wrap something else around it and pretend like you have your own model and you can call it something else. That probably is against some of their terms of service or etc., but there's nothing stopping you from being able to do it. And so this means that you can run it basically at whatever cost you can think of for acquiring your own hardware. And so this just makes it drastically cheaper. And you also have control over its usage. So this is where you can monitor how much it takes for resourcing. And then you can determine whether you pull it back or actually leverage it more. Whereas some of these other models that are basically SaaS-based, they get to control how much it costs, sometimes even how quickly you can use it or how much throughput you have. And so that gives a lot of power to these other companies that have built their SaaS product this way, like a ChatGPT or a Claude. I do think Claude might have an open source version, but it's certainly not as good as their primary version that they use in their SaaS model. And so this is a huge benefit for anybody who wants to use models like this for a variety of purposes. And this is a game changer in my mind for that reason, which is where if you are a random company or a random developer, now is a great opportunity to leverage a phenomenal model that works very well. You can use it on your laptop. You can start building some service on top of it. You don't need to worry about some SaaS subscription or your testing runs costing you hundreds or thousands of dollars for you to set up, or maybe even tens of thousands if you're going to try getting some customer usage out of it. And so it's going to drastically reduce startup costs for new AI-based products. And so this will likely proliferate AI products in the coming months and the next years based off of mechanisms like this that now exist.
Significantly easier to jump to the frontier, that is the front of the race, with a smaller budget and a smaller team.
In the last 2 weeks, AI research teams have really opened their eyes and have become way more ambitious on what's possible with a lot less capital. So previously, to get to the frontier, you'd have to think about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment and perhaps $1 billion of investment. What DeepSeek has now done here in Silicon Valley is it's opened our eyes to what you can actually accomplish with 10, 15, 20, $30 million.
It also means any company.
That's a little silly in my mind. I think having worked for other companies, for particular niches, you can definitely get a model that is state of the art in a particular segment for $1 million or less. It depends on how much you invest. And I think this is again where the standard model for businesses in the US and Silicon Valley in particular is they take in lots of money, they burn money very quickly, and they don't really think about profitability. And so I have not worked there again, so I'm not sure how true this is, but I would have to assume that there's a certain level of waste that is going on here just because they weren't optimizing for costs. They were optimizing for, let's be the first to market in this space. And that obviously got them pretty well known. The average consumer probably knows ChatGPT, but they probably can't list the other standard models. Maybe Gemini from Google, just because Google is so big and they reference it themselves in their own marketing, etc. But they're very unlikely to know, I would guess, to be able to name Claude or Llama, for instance, or any other models that exist. And so it did benefit them in some capacity, but they weren't optimizing for costs. And so again, they seem to keep referencing this as this thing that could only have been done given hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And I don't think that's the case. I think that was the individuals who were in charge of that project wanted to be the first ones, and they were willing to get there at any cost. And that cost happened to be very big. They weren't looking for the most efficient version. That's at least my expectation of why they got to those numbers, because clearly it's possible with less. Even if DeepSeek is off by a magnitude and it took them $12 million instead of $6 million as they stated, that's still noticeably less than what ChatGPT used. And so, again, I think they seem to be really highlighting this cost efficiency portion as though it was impossible to have accomplished. But again, I don't think that's what these folks were optimizing for. And it was definitely going to be easier for someone else to do it, especially now that it's been a couple years down the road. There's been more advancements. There's more open source tech that people are starting to use and leverage themselves. And they can also compete directly with these models because they could just pay for a subscription or something like that and just literally run their models against the other AI models and then start to correct them and see where they're being outperformed, etc., and just more directly have a line of sight to outperformance, whereas some of these other models were starting from scratch and there was no benchmark for what good was.
Company like OpenAI that claims the frontier today could lose it tomorrow. That's how DeepSeek was able to catch up so quickly. It started building on the existing frontier of AI. Its approach focusing on iterating on existing technology rather than reinventing the wheel.
They can take a really good big model and use a process called distillation. And what distillation is basically you use a very large model to help your small model get smart at the thing that you want it to get smart at. And that's actually very cost efficient.
It closed the gap by using available data sets, applying innovative tweaks, and leveraging existing models. So much so that DeepSeek's model has run into an identity crisis. It's convinced that it's ChatGPT. When you ask it directly, what model are you? DeepSeek responds, I'm an AI language model created by OpenAI, specifically based on the GPT-4 architecture. Leading OpenAI.
That is hilarious. That likely means that so again, like I was saying, you could probably check the output, and it is funny because I'm pretty sure folks like the New Yorker and other news outlets, etc., were mad at ChatGPT because they kept returning articles because clearly they were just having them scrape the internet for any and all information, and they likely pulled in that information from the internet either directly or indirectly, however it happened. And they were basically pushing back on this, and obviously those news sources were mad that basically their IP was taken. And so here, likely for DeepSeek to have that answer means it probably asked ChatGPT for a bunch of questions and then took the output from it for it to be certain that it is ChatGPT, though I'm sure they have probably fixed that bug or that questionnaire since this airing, so that way it shows itself as DeepSeek. But still, I would be surprised if they literally just quizzed ChatGPT for a bunch of information and then use that literally as their data set to then build off of, and then see how they would adjust their questionnaires, etc. from it, which would obviously save them a lot of time. If they didn't even have to go gather the data themselves, they can just kind of jump to the end by using other models and what data they have already scraped, and then the responses they have for a variety of questions.
AI CEO Sam Altman to post in a thinly veiled shot at DeepSeek just days after the model was released. It's relatively easy to copy something that you know works. It's extremely hard to do something new, risky, and difficult when you don't know if it will work. But that's not exactly what DeepSeek did. It emulated GPT by leveraging OpenAI's existing outputs and architecture principles while quietly introducing its own enhancements, really blurring the line between itself and ChatGPT. It all puts pressure on a closed source leader like OpenAI to justify its costlier model as more and potentially nimbler competitors emerge.
Everybody copies everybody in this field. You can say Google did the transformer first. It's not OpenAI, and OpenAI just copied it. Google built the first large language models. They didn't productize it, but OpenAI did it in a productized way. So you can say all this in many ways. It doesn't matter.
So if everyone is copying one another, it raises the question, is massive spend on individual LLMs even a good investment anymore? Now, no one has as much at stake as OpenAI. The startup raised over $6 billion in its last funding round alone. But the company has yet to turn a profit. And with its core business centered on building the models, it's much more exposed than companies like Google and Amazon, who have cloud and ad businesses bankrolling their spend. For OpenAI,
yeah, I'm sure they're going to have a lot of tough questions to answer right now about profitability, especially since they've been burning money so quickly and they're not profitable yet. Likely, I would have to expect this does cut into their revenue right now when there are much cheaper, reasonably competitive models that exist. And so they're going to have some very tough questions to answer with their board and other investors on what they're doing with their money, how they're going to make it out of this, and how they're going to actually succeed as a business. And again, I think this is where tech companies, and I feel like this is a sort of a fallacy of how tech companies have been functioning in Silicon Valley for decades now, which is you get the money, you burn the money basically as fast as you can, and then you hope you have a product that is actually profitable at the end of it. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And that's a really bad model. No other segment has this same phenomenon. And so tech has been able to get away with it for quite some time. And usually new tech gets away with it again and again and again. And when they look more strictly at past types of tech, you don't have as much leeway. We seem to keep going into this methodology of spend as much money as you can, don't think about business fundamentals, figure it out later after you do something cool. And so these people are probably in trouble right now and probably thinking through how are they going to solve this problem for themselves.
AI reasoning will be key. A model that thinks before it generates a response, going beyond pattern recognition to analyze, draw logical conclusions, and solve really complex problems. For now, the startup's O1 reasoning model, it's still cutting edge, but for how long?
Researchers at Berkeley showed that they could build a reasoning model for $450 just last week. So you can actually create these models that do thinking for much, much less. You don't need those huge amounts to pre-train the model. So I think the game is shifting.
It means that staying on top may require as much creativity as capital. DeepSeek's breakthrough also comes at a very tricky time for the AI darling, just as OpenAI is moving to a for-profit model and facing unprecedented brain drain. Can it raise more money at ever higher valuations if the game is changing? As Chamath Palihapitiya puts it, let me say the quiet part out loud. AI model building is a money trap. Those chip restrictions from the US government, they were intended to slow down the race, to keep American tech on American ground, to stay ahead in the race.
What we want to do is we want to keep it in this country. China is a competitor and others are competitors.
So instead, the restrictions might have been just what China needed.
Necessity is the mother of invention. Because they had to go figure out workarounds, they actually ended up building something a lot more efficient.
It's really remarkable the amount of progress they've made with as little capital as it's taken them to make that progress.
It drove them to get.
So again, I think this would have been possible with any hardware that they had available to them. And again, the way that they built their model was going to be more efficient either way because they were already leveraging existing techniques and existing models to help facilitate the training. And so it was going to be a fraction of the cost no matter which hardware they used. And so they keep kind of going back to this point. I don't think them not having access to the best chips is what led to this innovation. I think this was, again, somebody was going to be able to do this. They just happened to put the effort in and the intentionality behind it. And whether they use the fanciest chips or these chips, it wouldn't have necessarily changed how they went about solving this problem. Because again, hardware is the engine that drives the training. But if you think about it as anything else, like let's think about delivery trucks, for instance. Basically what you're saying is you had smaller trucks and therefore you were never going to be able to deliver all of your goods because there's just so many of them. And that's not the case. You could have one giant truck or you could have 10 smaller trucks and then deliver all of them in the separate trucks. Nothing was stopping you from doing that. And so that is really how this works for the hardware piece, which is like you could have had one beefy chipset and be good to go. But even for training, you likely would have had dozens of these or hundreds of these. And so if you went with a cheaper chip, you still need the same amount of processing to occur. And you can just offset that with more chips that are cheaper. So that didn't, in my mind, likely change this for them in any capacity. Because again, they just need to get it done. They need to do the training and they could have either added more chips to get this done in the same amount of time as they would have with larger, more powerful chips, or they could have just waited for them to train over a longer period of time. They could have gone either route and it still would have worked out fine. There's nothing requiring these two things to exist at the same time. And this is probably the failure on why these policies were made, is that they don't understand fundamentally how this system works. And so they're like, all right, let's just take the fanciest chips. They'll never catch up. But again, that doesn't work. You could just buy more. And even in the shipping example with the trucks, if we say 10 small trucks is equivalent to one large truck, you could still deliver everything faster if you had like 20 small trucks. Then you'd have double the amount of delivery power that you would for a single large truck. So you can't just prevent people from getting into AI by not allowing them to have the fanciest, most powerful chips. That's not how it works. That's a completely separate category of the needs in order to build things from how they chose to build the model. And again, that likely happened independently of what hardware they had available to them.
Creative, with huge implications. DeepSeek is an open source model, meaning that developers have full access and they can customize its weights or fine-tune it to their liking.
It's known that once open source is caught up or improved over closed source software, all developers migrate to that.
But key is that it's also inexpensive. The lower the cost, the more attractive it is for developers to adopt.
The bottom line is our inference cost is 10 cents per million tokens. And that's 1/30th of what the typical comparable model charges.
And where's it going?
The 10.
Yeah, that's crazy. Being 1/30th the price is insane. This is so much cheaper than other mechanisms. I didn't think it was 1 in 30. I thought it was closer to 1 in 10, but it's unclear exactly what they were comparing that to. But still, it's a magnitude cheaper, and that's one of the huge advantages that this brings over other models today.
10 cents would lead to building apps for much lower costs. So if you wanted to build a U.com or Perplexity or some other app, you can either pay OpenAI $4.40 per million tokens, or if you have our model, it costs you just 10 cents.
It could mean
Oh yeah, so they They said the word tokens here. So for folks who aren't familiar, this is something that's used basically to reference documents or inputs of some sort. So tokens are usually just the reference for basically what can be used for the model and what you can pass along to the model. And so this is just how they, high level, that's really what it is. It's like a ticket to have your stuff being processed. And so you are charged basically by how much you use at a particular time and how frequently you use them. And so that's just what that means high level.
The prevailing model in global AI may be open source, as organizations and nations come around to the idea that collaboration and decentralization, those things can drive innovation faster and more efficiently than proprietary closed ecosystems. A cheaper, more efficient, widely adopted open source model from China, that could lead to a major shift in dynamics.
That's more dangerous because then they get to own the mind share, the ecosystem.
In other words, the adoption of a Chinese open source model at scale, that could undermine US leadership while embedding China more deeply into the fabric of global tech infrastructure.
There's always like a point where open source can stop being open source too, right? So the licenses are very favorable today, but if
could close it.
Exactly, if over time they can always change the license. So it's important that we actually have people here in America building, and that's why Meta is so important.
Another consequence of China's AI breakthrough is giving its Communist Party control of the narrative. AI models built in China, they're forced to adhere to a certain set of rules set by the state. They must embody core socialist values. Studies have shown that models created by Tencent and Alibaba, they will censor historical events like Tiananmen Square, deny human rights abuse, and filter criticism of Chinese political leaders.
That contest is about whether we're going to have democratic AI informed by democratic values built to serve democratic purposes, or we're going to end.
Yeah, so this is where there are nuances to what's being done here, but I would expect most people's usages don't necessitate necessarily a accurate historical picture of what's going on politically in the world. Like, they used math problems there, they used coding problems. Those things are not going to have anything to do with these historical events that China is trying to like hide from their citizens and other folks. And so this is an advantage to other models. Another advantage to having closed source is while open source is generally used quite a bit because it's just so much cheaper to get started with, and if you're a cost-sensitive consumer, you're going to go with whatever is the cheapest option. But there are reasons why some of these things are paid. I think a classic example that comes to mind is that there's a variety of tools that currently exist, like WordPress, for instance, was something that was open source that people could use. But also a lot of people ended up using like WordPress.com, I think it was, that basically gave a hosted version of it so that way you as a user don't have to really worry about what's going on with it. And so there are advantages to having open source and also like classic SaaS versions of various software, because then you can kind of do more services for those individuals and the consumers of it. And so it might not be worth the free usage or free access if you have to then spend a lot of your time and money doing the other things you need to get done. Whereas one company can centralize that and make it easier at scale. So there are pros and cons to these things, but open source does get a lot of usage. And again, with how much cheaper some of these things are, it will likely pull usage from these other existing models.
End up with autocratic AI.
If developers really begin to adopt these models en masse because they're more efficient, that could have a serious ripple effect, trickle down to even consumer-facing AI applications, and influence how trustworthy those AI-generated responses from chatbots really are.
And there's really only two countries right now in the world that can build this at scale, and that is the US and China. And so, the consequences, the stakes.
Again, I'm not sure why these individuals think this is true. There's nothing stopping other countries from doing this. Like, literally nothing. You just need to have a fairly solid understanding of machine learning, maybe even I'll give them some credit. You have to have some fairly advanced knowledge, but there's nothing stopping those individuals from gaining that from any country. You could have, let's even just say US as an example. Let's say we have the knowledge here that we're training people with. There's nothing stopping someone from coming from another country like Europe or Africa or Australia or something like that, and then going to a school in America, learning our techniques, getting a bachelor's, master's, PhD, whatever level it is, and then going back to their country and then doing all that stuff there. It's not like this is proprietary information that like nobody knows how it works. These are techniques that exist. You can learn about these online yourself for free, and that there's certain institutions that are better at this than others, but there's nothing inherently stopping other countries from doing this. They might just choose not to, because there isn't necessarily an advantage of competing with these other companies for any particular reason. But we know China, for instance, does often recreate tech from America because they do like to have more control, like censorship, etc., in their products that they have. And so obviously they would be incentivized to make their own version, but there's nothing stopping anyone else from doing this. I'm not sure why these individuals keep having this interpretation of it, and maybe this is also partly why they're so amazed at how much cheaper it is being built by China, is maybe they didn't even think China could build it. But again, there's nothing stopping anyone from building it. If the UK decided that they really, really wanted a model that was kind of like this, that they want to market and show off to the world that they had it, they could probably have it in 6 months from now if they started today. And maybe even sooner, depending on how much funding they got or how bad they wanted to beat that timeline. But again, there's nothing stopping other countries. I'm a bit surprised at how much this news outlet is kind of implying that this is like an impossible feat.
In and around this are just enormous.
Enormous stakes, enormous consequences, and hanging in the balance, America's lead. For a topic so complex and new, we turn to an expert who's actually building in the space and model agnostic. Perplexity co-founder and CEO Arvind Srinivas, who you heard from throughout our piece, he sat down with me for more than 30 minutes to discuss DeepSeek and its implications, as well as Perplexity's roadmap. We think it's worth listening to that whole conversation, so here it is.
So first, I want to know what the stakes are. Describe the AI race between China and the US and what's at stake.
Okay, so first of all, China has a lot of disadvantages in competing with the US. Number one is
completely unrelated to whatever this individual is saying, but I just love the fact that they got basically like a tech founder who's in a t-shirt and a hoodie. Like, I feel like this is just classic tech outfit right here. So I have to respect that he came onto the news with this outfit. I feel like I've seen so many engineers come in for like interviews like this, and so sometimes you can get a huge spectrum. Some people will like completely dress to the nines, full suit, tie, everything, and then some people will be there in like sweatpants for really important events. And so I just gotta respect that he decided to do this news interview, and potentially his first very big public appearance, t-shirt and hoodie. I think it's just classic dev mentality, so I gotta respect that.
The fact that they don't get access to all the hardware that we have access to here. So they're kind of working with lower end GPUs than us. It's almost like working with the previous generation GPUs crappily. And the fact that the bigger models tend to be more smarter naturally puts them at disadvantage. But the flip side of this is that necessity is the mother of invention. Because they had to go figure out workarounds, they actually ended up building something a lot more efficient. It's like saying, hey, look, you guys really got to get a top-notch model, and I'm not going to give you resources, and like figure out something, right? Unless it's mathematically possible to prove that it's impossible to do so, you can always try to like come up with something more efficient. But that is likely to make them come up with a more efficient solution than America. And of course, they've open sourced it, so we can still adopt something like that here. But that kind of talent they're building to do that will become an edge for them over time, right? The leading open source model in America is Meta's Llama family. It's really good. It's kind of like a model that you can run on a computer. But even though it got pretty close to GPT-4 and Sonnet at the time of its release, the model that was closest in quality was the giant 405B, not the 70B that you could run on your computer. And so there was still not a small, cheap, fast, efficient open source model that rivaled the most powerful closed models from OpenAI and Anthropic. Nothing from America, nothing from Mistral AI either. And then these guys come out with like a crazy model that's like 10x cheaper in API pricing than GPT-4o and 15x cheaper than Sonnet, I believe. Really fast, 60 tokens per second, and pretty much equal or better in some benchmarks and worse in some others, but like roughly in that ballpark of 4O's quality. And they did it all with like approximately just 2048 H800 GPUs, which is actually equivalent to like somewhere around 1500 or 1500 H100 GPUs. That's like 20 to 30x lower than the amount of GPUs that GPT-4 is usually trained on. They roughly $5 million in total compute budget. They did it with so little money and such an amazing model, gave it away for free, wrote a technical paper, and definitely it makes us all question like, okay, like if we have the equivalent of Doge for like model training, this is an example of that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Efficiency.
Yeah.
Seems like we have quite a bit of time left as they go into this interview. So thank you if you've been watching up to this point. If you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, please hit like or subscribe. I'll keep watching and keep reacting to this, but just want to thank everyone who's been hanging out this long for this video, and we'll see what else they have to share here.
Is what you're getting at. So fraction of the price,
Yeah.
fraction of the time,
Yeah.
dumbed down GPUs, essentially. What was your surprise when you understood what they had done?
So my surprise was that when I actually went through the technical paper, the amount of clever solutions they came up with. First of all, they train a mixture of experts model. It's not that easy to train. There's a lot of like, the main reason people find it difficult to catch up with OpenAI, especially in the MOE architecture, is that there's a lot of irregular loss spikes. The numerics are not stable. So often like you got to restart the training checkpoint again, and a lot of infrastructure needs to be built for that. And they came up with very clever solutions to balance that without adding additional hacks. And they also figured out floating point 8-bit training, at least for some of the numerics. And they cleverly figured out which has to be in higher precision, which has to be in lower precision. To my knowledge, I think floating point 8 training is not that well understood. I think most of the training in America is still running in FP16, maybe OpenAI, and some people are trying to explore that, but it's pretty difficult to get it right. So because necessary, some other...
You're getting pretty technical here, actually. So there might be some devs out in the audience right now who are following generally what this is. So basically, he's talking about floating points. Generally speaking, this is, you can think about it as like how many decimals are being used in numbers. So it's usually used, as he mentioned, for precision. So it is useful to have higher and higher precision, but then that requires higher and higher overhead. And so this is a classic problem that exists when you're interacting with hardware, etc., which is they're going a little technical here as well. There are literal bits that have to be turned on and off. And so each of those bits require extra power and extra space and extra memory, all of that stuff in order to be processed. So while you increase your precision, you get more and more accurate, but then you also end up potentially taking longer, being more costly, etc. And so if you shrink that down, the opposite is true, which is sometimes you can be faster, you can be cheaper, etc., but then you'll lose some of the precision that you get. This is where not every task needs a very high level of precision, and most things like float8 with like have a decent amount of precision for most human purposes. And so this is just what they're kind of going through here, which is he's describing that he believes that China is better at processing these lower precision versions than potentially folks in the US. But again, this is usually an efficiency play. So I have actually interacted with this myself for some of the AI models I've worked on, just because it saves you money, generally speaking, and makes things a little bit faster. And so if you can change the level of precision that you have for training and or execution, it's a win. And so, again, I'm not sure exactly what this individual's role at his particular company is or how much knowledge he has backing this, but there's probably a reason why ChatGPT or OpenAI isn't using these things, and it's probably just because they don't care as much about that efficiency. Again, they're spending so much money that clearly hasn't been their primary focus. And just because they haven't leveraged it doesn't mean that they're incapable of learning this. Same thing as just because other countries haven't made their own models like this doesn't mean that they can't. It's just how they're pursuing this work. And some companies aim for cost efficiency and some companies just aim for the most precise version. And so again, they were trying to start from scratch. They went from potentially raw data sets, whereas these other models are leveraging output from existing AI models. And so there's a bunch of topics that won't necessarily need that much precision at all.
I've been mentioned because they don't have that much memory, that many GPUs. They figured out a lot of numerical stability stuff that makes their training work, and they claimed in the paper that for majority of the training was stable, which means what? They can always rerun those training runs again, and on more data or better data, and then it only trained for 60 days, so it's pretty amazing.
Safe to say you were surprised.
So I was definitely
60 days, that is surprising to me. But again, this is where you have to be a little bit cautious of some of these self-reported numbers. One, not necessarily because I don't think 60 days is enough to train a model for this, but because they might have done, this might exclude other test runs, things like that that you would do. So just because the final model that you built with your full data set took 60 days to train doesn't mean you only use 60 days to train this model from scratch. I'm sure they have previous iterations that they've worked on. They've kind of perfected this model of training and how they're going to go about it. So I'm a bit surprised that it took them 60 days. But again, I doubt this is the full picture. They likely had to do some experimentation that allowed for them to be this efficient. They probably didn't just start it up and go, let's take as long as we need, and it happened to be 60 days. They probably put a lot of thought, as mentioned with the precision levels, into how efficiently and cost effectively they can build a model. And so it being done in 60 days is definitely an intentional effort from them. It didn't just happen that way.
So usually the wisdom, or like I wouldn't say wisdom, the myth is that Chinese are just good at copying. So if we stop writing research papers in America, if we stop describing the details of our infrastructure or architecture, and stop open sourcing, they're not going to be able to catch up. But the reality is some of the details in DeepSeek v3 are so good that I wouldn't be surprised if Meta took a look at it and incorporated some of that in
Tried to
Llama
copy
4.
them.
Right? I wouldn't necessarily say copy. It's all like, sharing science, engineering. But the point is like, it's changing. Like, it's not like China is copycat. They're also innovating.
We don't know exactly the data that it was trained on, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's open source. We know some of the ways and things it was trained on, but not everything.
Correct.
And there's this idea that it was trained on public ChatGPT outputs, which would mean it just was copied, but you're saying it goes beyond that. There's real innovation in
Yeah, look, I mean, they've trained it on 14.8 trillion tokens. The internet has so much ChatGPT. If you actually go to any LinkedIn post or X post now, most of the comments are written by AI. You can just see it. Like, people are just trying to write. In fact, even within X, there's like a Grok tweet and half.
So I'm not sure exactly where he's going to go with this, but I think that was a reasonable question that this individual just asked. And so it isn't necessarily cheating or copying, because again, they were using this predominantly for training purposes. And so it's no more copying than necessarily like ChatGPT did with news articles. And so you need some data to train your model on. And so it's really smart to ask various questions and then get the answers and then use that to train, instead of trying to gather a huge data set and then figure out how to answer a variety of questions from that. And so just using publicly available ChatGPT for asking questions and getting answers isn't necessarily cheating, so to speak. But you're definitely referencing it and copying from that and leveraging that to your own purposes, For them to have higher marks in a variety of segments means that they also had to have augmented that data with something. So they weren't just 100% copying ChatGPT, but clearly they did use it quite a bit, to the point where if their model said it was ChatGPT, clearly they used it quite a bit.
Or in LinkedIn, there's a AI enhancer, or in Google Docs and Word, there are AI tools to like rewrite your stuff. So if you do something there and copy paste somewhere on the internet, it's naturally going to have some elements of a ChatGPT like training, right? And there's a lot of people who don't even bother to strip away that I'm a language model part. So they just paste it somewhere, and like it's very difficult to control for this. I think XAI has spoken about this too. So I wouldn't like disregard their technical accomplishment just because like for some prompts like who are you or like which model are you, it responds like that. It doesn't even matter in my opinion.
For a long time, we thought, I don't know if you agreed with this, China was behind in AI. What does this do to that race? Can we say that China is catching up, or has it caught up?
I mean, like, if we say that Meta is catching up to OpenAI and Anthropic, if you make that claim, then the same claim can be made for China catching up to America. A lot of papers from China that have tried to replicate O1. In fact, I saw more papers from China after O1 announcement that tried to replicate it than from America. Like, and the amount of compute DeepSeek has access to is roughly similar to what PhD students in the US have access to. By the way, this is not meant to like criticize others. Like even for ourselves, like, you know, for Perplexity, we decided not to train models because we thought it's like a very expensive thing.
Yeah.
We thought like there's no way to catch up with the rest. But
will you incorporate DeepSeek into Perplexity?
We already are beginning to use it. I think they have an API, and we're also they have open source of it, so we can host it ourselves too. And it's good to like try to start using that because it actually allows us to do a lot of the things at lower cost. But what I'm kind of thinking is beyond that, which is like, okay, if these guys actually could train such a great model with this, you know, good team, like, and there's no excuse anymore for companies in the US, including ourselves, to like not try to do something like that.
You hear a lot in public from a lot of, you know, thought leaders in generative AI, both on the research side, on the entrepreneur.
So something he just mentioned there is that even for his own company, he might be incentivized to try this. So depending on what he meant there, I'm not sure if I agree with that statement. So again, for having open source tech in a variety of ways 100% discourages reinventing the wheel if you already have access to a wheel already. I think the broader statement of people questioning how much it takes to build a model and trying to be a little bit more innovative with your approaches to it, I think makes a lot of sense. But also, this model was able to be generated much more cheaply because they were trying to follow the exact footsteps of another model that they had access to. This wouldn't necessarily be the case for something that is not available on the market today, that you can't kind of use to leapfrog ahead of them with some cost efficiency. But it is true that you could start using this for a variety of purposes to save money. But again, I think for this exact case, it doesn't really make sense when there's an open source model that you already like. And this generally happens with any open source technology. It's available to you, you can change it, you can poke around with it. There's no reason to build it from scratch when you already have basically all of it in hand.
Entrepreneurial side, like Elon Musk and others say that China can't catch up. Like the stakes are too big, the geopolitical stakes. Whoever dominates AI is going to kind of dominate the economy, dominate the world. You know, it's been talked about in those massive terms. Are you worried about what China proved it was able to do?
Firstly, I don't know if Elon ever said China can't catch up. I'm not aware.
Just the threat of China. He's only identified the threat of letting China. And, you know, Sam Altman has said similar things. We can't let China win the AI race.
You know, it's all, I think you got to decouple what someone like Sam says to like what is in his self-interest, right? Look, I think my point is like whatever you did to not let them catch up didn't even matter. They ended up catching up anyway.
Necessity is the mother of invention,
exactly.
Like you said.
And it's actually, you know, what's more dangerous than trying to do all the things to like not let them catch up and like, you know, all this stuff is what's more dangerous is they have the best open source model and all the American developers are building on that.
Right.
That's more dangerous because then they get to own the mind share, the ecosystem. If the entire American AI ecosystem, look, in general, it's known that once open source is caught up or improved over closed source software, all developers migrate to that. It's historically known, right?
When Llama was being built and becoming more widely used, there was this question, should we trust Zuckerberg? But now the question is, should we trust China? That's a very
You should trust
different...
open source. That's the, like, it's not about who, is it Zuckerberg or is it...
Does it matter then if it's Chinese, if it's open source?
Look, it doesn't matter in the sense that you still have full control.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I don't think it really matters whether China made this model or some other US company did it. The only things here are, I haven't really looked into some of these censored topics myself, and so that could be baked into the model, and so you might not be able to control that. And so that is a risk that exists, is that there's like inherent bias in the models that are available. And that's going to be true for any model, though this one might be especially biased in particular areas. And so that might not be something you can tweak yourself. And so that does have some repercussions depending on your usage of it. But again, that's a particularly niche segment, and they're not going to censor like math, for instance. And so that is a concern that you would have, is how do some of these things function at their core and how much flexibility do you have? But I would still imagine for the vast majority of things, they will work just as well as you would want them to. And especially with them being open source, if you have them in-house, one of the concerns that you could have is sharing your data with somebody else. But if it's running on your laptop and you can prevent it from sending anything anywhere else, then you're going to trust that one quite a bit, at least for a privacy segment. But again, you have to take that into consideration with how much do you trust the output of that model. And I don't think any model is 100% accurate where you completely blindly trust it today. And so that is something to take into consideration. But I agree with him that it probably doesn't matter whether it's China or not, because it is open source.
It's, you run it as your own set of weights on your own computer. You are in charge of the model, but it's not a great look for our own like talent to rely on software built by others. Even if it's open source, there's always like a point where open source can stop being open source too, right?
So that was an interesting statement that he just made. I don't know this individual's background. They just kind of mentioned that he's from this company. And so he mentioned that it's not good to use these open source tools, which is odd. I would expect from a standard developer or engineer that you would generally promote open source technology and its usage, just because by definition, open source is basically a community version. People have access to it, and so people can fork it, they can start developing on it, they can share their learnings and advancements together. And so that's generally considered a good thing in the industry from my expectation. And so there's nothing really like shaming people from not using them. There's no real benefit to not using it. That would be like saying you have to build your own bridges because otherwise you'll be inferior if you end up using the bridges made by the government. That's just bad engineering. Like, that doesn't make too much sense to me. I'm not sure if he's going to elaborate on this more, but that is a little surprising. I wouldn't expect any engineer to make that statement, broadly speaking.
So the licenses are very favorable today, but
You could close it.
Exactly. If over time, they can always change the license. So it's important that we actually have people.
So they would be able to change the license. I don't know how much you'd be able to retroactively change licenses. So likely you'd be able to fork whatever version exists now. So like if you just took a copy of DeepSeek today, if you were really worried about this, you could probably use that in perpetuity. I don't think there is a valid court case of leveraging something that was made open source after they make a new version that has changed. You might not get the new updates, but still, this model that exists right now, if it's already competitive with ChatGPT, will be competitive for the remainder of the next few years. And especially if it's cheaper, there's no reason not to use it. And so they can change their licensing, but it's not going to prevent you from using what is currently open sourced and available to you.
people here in America building, and that's why Meta is so important. Like I still think Meta will build a better model than DeepSeek v3 and open source it, and what they'll call it Llama 4 or 3 point something, doesn't matter. But I think what is more key is that we don't like try to focus all our energy on banning them and stopping them, and just try to outcompete and win them. Like that's just the American way of doing things. Just be better.
And it feels like there's, we hear a lot more about these Chinese companies who are developing in a similar way, a lot more efficiently, a lot more cost effectively, right?
Yeah. Again, like look, it's hard to fake scarcity, right? If you raise 10 billion and you're decided to spend 80% of it on a compute cluster, it's hard for you to come up with the exact same solution that someone with 5 million would do. And there's no point, no need to like sort of berate those who are putting more money. They're trying to do it as fast as they can.
When we say open source, there's so many different versions. Some people criticize Meta for not publishing everything. And even DeepSeek itself isn't totally transparent.
Sure. Yeah, you can go to the limits of open source and say, I should exactly be able to replicate your training run. But first of all, how many people even have the resources to do that? And compare, like I think the amount of detail they've shared in the technical report. Actually, Meta did that too, by the way. Meta's Llama 3.3 technical report is incredibly detailed and very great for science. So the amount of details these people are sharing is already a lot more than what the other companies are doing right now.
When you think about how much it costs DeepSeek to do this, less than $6 million, think about what OpenAI has spent to develop GPT models. What does that mean for the closed source model ecosystem trajectory, momentum? What does it mean for OpenAI?
I mean, it's very clear that we'll have like an open source version of 4.0 or even better than that, and much cheaper than that, open source, like completely this year.
Made by OpenAI?
Probably not. Most likely not. And I don't think they care if it's not made by them. I think they've already moved to a new paradigm called the O1 family of models. Look, there. I can't like Ilya Sutskever came and said pre-training is at a wall, right? So, I mean, he didn't exactly use the word, but he clearly said the age of pre-training is over.
Many people have said that.
Right? So that doesn't mean scaling is hit a wall. I think we're scaling on different dimensions now. The amount of time model spends thinking at test time, reinforcement learning, like trying to like make the model, okay, if it doesn't know what to do for a new prompt, it'll go and reason and collect data and interact with the world, use a bunch of tools. I think that's where things are headed. And I feel like OpenAI is more focused on that right now.
Yeah. Instead of just the bigger, better model,
correct,
reasoning capacities. But didn't you say that DeepSeek is likely to turn their attention to reasoning?
100%. I think they will. And that's why I'm pretty excited about what they'll produce next.
I guess then my question is sort of, what's OpenAI's moat now?
Well, I still think that no one else has produced a system similar to the O1 yet, exactly. I know that like there's debates about whether O1 is actually worth it. On maybe a few prompts it's really better, but like most of the times it's not producing any differentiated output from Sonnet. But at least the results they showed in O3 where they had like competitive coding performance and almost like an AI software engineer level.
Isn't it just a matter of time though before the internet is filled with reasoning data that DeepSeek?
Again, it's possible. Nobody knows yet.
Yeah.
So until it's done, it's still uncertain, right?
Right.
So maybe that uncertainty is their mode, that like no one else has the same reasoning capability yet, but will.
So at least my interpretation of her question is basically like, what separates OpenAI and like why would they still be competitive as a business right now when other people like DeepSeek can come in and make a similar model? Can't they just keep chasing OpenAI? And won't that hurt them in the long term? And so for me, I think referencing the data sets is probably something that for myself is an interesting point, which is one of the issues that like ChatGPT is running into is that it needs expertise. So like it's good at a lot of common tasks, but once you start getting into the more advanced tasks that like you need specialists for, so like arithmetic. Anybody can do that, but like who can do the highest level of math is only going to be like researchers or PhD individuals who have spent years and years focusing in on this particular area, or law or healthcare, etc. And so there's going to be particular expertise niches that exist, and this is where they aren't as good. And so they would have to build out data sets in order to kind of train models to be as good as experts. And I think that's where models really start to have the most advanced usage comes from that. Whereas a lot of what it's used for is general purpose. Basically, any human being could probably do some of this reasoning, especially if they had access to Google, for instance. They could probably take a minute, Google, and then give you a response. These models just do it a little bit faster. But for things that are much more advanced, you're going to have a proper data set for it. And so any models that are trained off of the output of other models, you aren't necessarily getting the true data set that it was trained off of and what is true or not true. And also ChatGPT is wrong in and of itself sometimes. And so this is where they presumably could have asked ChatGPT a bunch of questions, and then they could have just made sure that those answers were accurate before they actually trained it. But this is going to get harder and harder as you get into more niche and specialized areas, which ChatGPT and OpenAI already know. And now that they know that people are using them to train their own models, they will probably spend more time to avoid this from happening again. And so this is where they do have an advantage in going kind of the harder path, as they mentioned, of starting from scratch. Is they literally can do it from the original data set. And so it's unclear what DeepSeek has at this point, and also how much they'd be able to advance on their own, separate from whatever they gain access to from ChatGPT, for instance. Whereas ChatGPT is working on its own with its own data, and it's still kind of plowing ahead. And so that is the interesting part here. I do think DeepSeek could continue to learn. They could take similar data, they could take similar logic, and they could continue to advance on their models that way and do it in a very efficient fashion. But I would say that's, in my opinion, their mode, is that ChatGPT has a lot of good data. They're also going to have to spend a lot of money to get a lot of expertise. This does cost money, not just training. You might need to hire, the best mathematicians to answer questions or share some knowledge so that it can go into the model. And that is going to cost money. And so that is inherently going to be true for anyone who has to gather this data the first time.
By end of this year, will there be multiple players even in the reasoning arena? I absolutely think so.
So are we seeing the commoditization of large language models?
I think we'll see a similar trajectory, just like how in pre-training and like post-training, that sort of system for getting commoditized, where this year will be a lot more commoditization there. I think the reasoning kind of models will go through a similar trajectory, where in the beginning, one or two players really know how to do it, but over time,
and who knows, right? Because OpenAI could make another advancement to focus on.
Correct.
But right now, reasoning is their mode.
But by the way, if advancements keep happening again and again and again, I think the meaning of the word advancement also loses some of its value, right?
Totally. Even now, it's very difficult, right? Because there's pre-training advancements.
Yeah.
And then we've moved into a different phase.
Yeah. So what is guaranteed to happen is whatever models exist today, that level of reasoning, that level of multimodal capability in 5 to 10x cheaper models, open source, all that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of time. What is unclear is if something like a model that reasons at test time will be extremely cheap enough that we can just all run it on our phones. I think that's not clear to me yet.
It feels like so much of the landscape has changed with what DeepSeek was able to prove. Could you call it China's ChatGPT moment?
Possible. I mean, I think it certainly probably gave them a lot of confidence that we're not really behind, and no matter what you do to restrict our compute, we can always figure out some workarounds. And yeah, I'm sure the team feels pumped about the results.
How does this change the investment landscape? The hyperscalers that are spending tens of billions of dollars a year on CapEx, they've just ramped it up huge. Yeah. And OpenAI and Anthropic that are raising billions of dollars for GPUs, essentially. But what DeepSeek told us is you don't necessarily need that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it's very clear that they're gonna go even harder on reasoning because they understand that like whatever they were building in the previous 2 years is getting extremely cheap. That it doesn't make sense to go justify raising that
Is the
amount of
spending
capital.
proposition the same? Do they need the same amount of, high-end GPUs, or can you reason using the lower-end ones that DeepSeek has?
Again, it's hard to say no until proven it's not. But I guess like in the spirit of moving fast, you would want to use the high-end chips, and you would want to like move faster than your competitors. I think like the best talent still wants to work in the team that made it happen first. There's always some glory.
Yeah, I agree with that second part of what he said. I'm not sure why in the first part he said you can't say no until it happens. Obviously, again, you'd be able to use the cheaper chips. I'm not sure why they seem so hung up on this higher end chips versus lower end chips. That certainly isn't going to prevent the training of particular models. But broadly, I do agree with him in that second segment.
To like who did this actually, like who's the real pioneer versus who's the fast follow, right?
That was like kind of like Sam Altman's tweet, kind of veiled response to.
Yeah, this is that segment of being ahead. You're going to pay for the speed and you're trying to get ahead of your competition. And so it's going to be costly to be the front runner. And that's going to be true in any environment, tech or otherwise. And so you're spending for taking and having that lead, not necessarily for the efficiency. So they're basically like running different races right now.
What DeepSeek has been able to, you kind of implied that they just copied and anyone can copy, right?
Yeah, but then you can always say that like everybody copies everybody in this field. You can say Google did the transformer first. It's not OpenAI, and OpenAI just copied it. Google built the first large language models. They didn't productize it, but OpenAI did it in a productized way. So you can say all this in many ways. It doesn't matter.
I remember asking you, being like, why don't you want to build the model?
Yeah,
that's,
I know.
That's the glory. And a year later, just 1 year later, you look very, very smart to not engage in that extremely expensive race that has become so competitive. And you kind of have this lead now in what everyone wants to see now, which is like real world applications, killer applications of generative AI. Talk a little bit about like that decision and how that's sort of guided you and where you see Perplexity going from here.
Look, 1 year ago, I don't even think we had something like, this is what, like 2024 beginning, right? I feel like we didn't even have something like Sonnet 3.5.
Right.
We had GPT-4, I believe, and it was kind of nobody else was able to catch up to it.
Yeah.
But there was no multimodal, nothing. And my sense was like, okay, if people with way more resources and way more talent cannot catch up, it's pretty difficult to play that game. So let's play a different game. Anyway, people want to use these models, and there's one use case of asking questions and getting accurate answers with sources, with real-time information, accurate information. There's still a lot of work there to do outside the model and making sure the product works reliably, keep scaling it up to usage, keep building custom UIs. There's just a lot of work to do, and we would focus on that. And we would benefit from all the tailwinds of models getting better and better. That's essentially what happened. In fact, I would say Sonnet 3.5 made our product so good in the sense that if you use Sonnet 3.5 as the model choice within Perplexity, it's very difficult to find a hallucination. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it dramatically reduced the rate of hallucinations, which meant the problem of question answering, asking a question, getting an answer, doing a fact checks, research, going and asking anything out there, because almost all the information is on the web, was such a big unlock. And that helped us grow 10x over the course of the year in terms of usage.
And you've made huge strides in terms of users. And, we hear on CNBC a lot, like big investors who are huge fans.
Yeah.
Jensen Huang himself, right?
Yeah,
he mentioned it in his keynote the other night.
He's a pretty regular user, actually. He's not just saying it. He's actually a pretty regular user.
So a year ago, we weren't even talking about monetization because you guys were just so new and you wanted to, get yourselves out there and build some scale. But now you are looking at things like that, increasingly an ad model, right?
Yeah, we're experimenting with it. I know like there's some controversy on like why should we do ads, whether you can have a truthful answer engine despite having ads. And in my opinion, we've been pretty proactively thoughtful about it, where we said, okay, as long as the answer is always accurate, unbiased, and not corrupted by someone's like advertising budget, only you get to see some sponsored questions, and even the answers to those sponsored questions are not influenced by them. And questions are also like, not picked in a way where it's manipulative. Sure, there's some things that the advertiser also wants, which is they want you to know about their brand and they want you to know the best parts of their brand. Just like how you go and if you're introducing yourself to someone, you want them to see the best parts of you, right? So that's all there. But you still don't have to click on a sponsored question. You can ignore it. And we are only charging them CPM right now. So we ourselves are not even incentivized to make you click yet. So I think considering all this, we're actually trying to get it right long term, instead of going the Google way of forcing you to click on links.
I remember when people were talking about the commoditization of models a year ago, and you thought, oh, it was controversial, but now it's not controversial. It's kind of like that's happening. And you keeping your eye on that is smart.
By the way, we benefit a lot from model commoditization, except we also need to figure out something to offer to the paid users, like a more sophisticated research agent that can do like multi-step reasoning, go and like do like 15 minutes worth of searching and give you like a analysis, an analyst type of answer. All that's going to come, all that's going to stay in the product. Nothing changes there. But there's a ton of questions every free user asks day-to-day basis that needs to be quick, fast answers. Like it shouldn't be slow. And all that will be free, whether you like it or not. It has to be free. That's what people are used to. And that means like figuring out a way to make that free traffic also monetizable.
So you're not trying to change user habits, but it's interesting because you are kind of trying to teach new habits to advertisers. They can't have everything that they have in a Google 10 blue links search. What's the response been from them so far? Are they willing to accept some of the trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, that's why they're trying stuff. Like Intuit is working with us, and then there's many other brands. Dell, like all these people are working with us to test, right? They're also excited about look, everyone knows that like whether they like it or not, 5 to 10 years from now, most people are going to be asking AIs most of the things and not on the traditional search engine. Everybody understands that. So everybody wants to be early adopters of the new platforms, new UX, and learn from it and build things together. Not like they're not viewing it as like, okay, you guys go figure out everything else and then we'll come later.
I'm smiling because
we're getting towards the end here. I'd be curious what your thoughts are on these technologies, AI in general. What surprised you the most through some of these discussions and interviews? Please post those in the comments if you have them.
Goes back perfectly to the point you made when you first sat down today, which is necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And that's what advertisers are essentially looking at. They're saying this field is changing. We have to learn to adapt with it. Okay, Arvind, I took up so much of your time. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Same to all of you. Thank you so much if you've lasted all this time. If you have made it to this point, please hit like and subscribe. I will see you around.